Hello everyone, and welcome back to Complete and Total Random. For today, we're going to be going over 7 more viewer suggestions for vehicles we could get added to War Thunder. And I'd just like to thank you guys all for all of the continued support on these videos. It's been great. These videos have been really fun to make, just going over all these interesting designs and reading through all the history on these vehicles and stuff. So with that, let's get into the video. To start off with, we will go over the T-22E1 medium tank. During 1942, the US military was already making plans to replace the M4 Sherman. This series of prototypes started with the T-20 and carried on to the T-22. These tanks were all planned to sport the 76mm cannons as seen on the later Shermans, except for one prototype, known as the T-20E1, which was planned to mount a 75mm cannon as well as an autoloader. The T-20E1 design would be used to build the T-22E1 prototype. This prototype is the first known vehicle in history to mount an autoloader. The autoloader was capable of firing about 20 rounds per minute. This series of vehicles suffered from many issues with reliability. And the T-22E1 specifically would be cancelled in 1943 due to the military no longer thinking the 75mm cannon to be sufficient for anti-tank purposes. And yeah, I think this prototype would be awesome to see in War Thunder, as it's the first example of an auto-loading tank in history. And yeah. Let's get on to the next tank. Next up, we have the Cardin-Lloyd Mark VI with the 47mm cannon. This Belgian modification of the Cardin-Lloyd chassis was built in 1933, when the Belgians felt they needed a more mobile way to transport their 47mm anti-tank cannons. 6 of these machines would be built in total. These vehicles did suffer from many drawbacks, such as the fact that their gun shield and all that only had 5mm of frontal armor, making it very vulnerable to small arms fire, as well as the fact that the crew was only covered from the front. Any flanking attacks would be devastating to this vehicle. It sported a crew of 2. They were both very overwhelmed, and this is part of the reason this vehicle would not see service. And this is part of the reason this vehicle would not see much service. These were replaced by the T-13 series of tank destroyers we talked about in an earlier video, though they all would see combat, where they were used in dug-in positions in an attempt to help fight off the Germans. This was due to the fact that their reliability over the years had faltered and the chassis had worn out, making them unsuitable for any other role than static defense. It is unknown the effectiveness of these vehicles, but it would be really interesting to see some more Belgian vehicles in game, and I think this would be a really interesting start. Next up, we have the KV-0. This was the initial prototype developed for the KV-1 tank. This tank was designed to replace the T-35 with a more armored vehicle. It used the same 76mm cannon as on the production KV-1. Its main difference was its coaxial 45mm cannon. This tank was designed around the concept of deep battle, the idea of going into combat, breaking through enemy lines, and basically just causing chaos behind enemy lines. Though I couldn't find any documentation on why this cannon was removed from the production vehicles, my guess would be that for one person, loading 2 different cannons at once in a cramped turret was just not feasible. Though I do think this will be a really interesting vehicle to add into game. Things like the T-1E1 and the Moz with their twin cannons are really interesting, and they give a kind of slightly different dynamic to how they play. Probably be a good 3.7, 4.0 tank. And yeah, I would love to see that vehicle in game. Next up, we have the Swiss G13 with the PaK-51 cannon. This is a Swiss post-war Jagdpanzer 38. After the end of World War II, the Swiss were looking for more armored vehicles to add to their fighting force, and due to the large amount of Jagdpanzer 38s for sale from Czechoslovakia, the Swiss would purchase a large quantity. Initially, they would actually equip them with a slightly different cannon. They would add the Stuck 40 cannon to these vehicles, though this would eventually be deemed obsolete due to other more modern tanks having more firepower and the fact that they were using multiple different types of ammunition. So this caused the Swiss to uparm at least one tank with the PaK 51 cannon. I can't find much information on how many of these modifications were done. There seems to be very little information on the Swiss use of their G13s. Though this would have put this tank in line with the firepower of their other tanks of the time, as well as sharing the same ammunition, allowing for a bit more efficiency in their fighting force and their logistics. I think this would be a great tank to see in game. A little bit different firepower from the standard Hetzer we have, as well as just being some representation for Swiss vehicles, because we don't really have many of those in game at the moment. Next up, we have the Panzerkampfwagen B2. After the fall of France, many tanks were captured and put into German service. This includes tanks such as the B1 and B1 bis heavy tanks, which Germany initially had no idea what to do with, just because of their strange layout and not really fitting with their doctrines. One idea they came up with is due to the uselessness of the hull-mounted 75mm cannon, the Germans decided to replace it with a flamethrower. These modifications would be ready in time for the invasion of the Soviet Union and would be used on the front line to try and destroy fortifications. Though these flamethrowers were quickly realized to be ineffective against most fortifications, and this caused them to be pulled from frontline service and kind of just sat for the rest of the war. Not much is known about what happened to them. I would assume they were probably scrapped for steel, like many other of the older tanks in the German arsenal at the time. I think this would also make a really great tank to low-tier Germany, giving something with a slightly different play style, as well as adding something that Germany doesn't have, which is a flamethrower vehicle. And I'd just like to see more flamethrower vehicles in game. And then next up, we have the Soviet BDRM-2, Amphibious Armored Car. This four-wheeled armored car was built in large numbers by the Soviets and sold to over 50 countries. Able to propel itself on its four wheels at 90 kilometers an hour on or off land. It was exceptionally fast, especially in the water. This series of vehicles was equipped with many different weapon systems that we could see added into game, from the same missile system that is used on the Strela that we already have in game, as well as things like the Konkur's anti-tank missile, and many more systems. I think this would be a great addition to the Soviet tech tree to allow us just a bit more armored cars, because they don't really have too many of those, and a bit more variety. These chassis were not very armored, only having about 5 to 10 millimeters of armor across their whole system, as well as they had the interesting feature of not only having their 4 main wheels, but also up to 4 little wheels attached to the bottom of the chassis to basically give it more ground pressure in certain circumstances. Though I can't find many pictures of this in use, these would still be a great addition to the game, give us a bit more variety, something a little bit faster to go into the higher tier Soviet lineups and all that. And next up, we have the Cadillac Gauge Commando. This early Cold War American armored car, like the BDRM-2, was equipped with many different loadouts, such as the 90mm Merkar cannon, and anything else up to like the 20mm Vulcan. This armored car could reach speeds up to 100 kilometers an hour, and it could fill a lot of different voids and different roles, which is why I think this would be a great addition to the American tree, as it could fill out so many holes and as well as give the Americans a lot more armored cars than they have, because they have a very, very limited number of armored cars in their tech tree. And with that, guys, let's get on to the final vehicle. So finally, we have the British Bishop self-propelled gun. This vehicle came from a need for more mobile artillery. This was realized during the Desert Campaign in World War II. And the idea was basically they would take a Valentine chassis of Mark II and replace the turret with a superstructure to allow a quick-fire 25-pounder howitzer. 80 of these would be built, but they had many limitations to the chassis, and also their really large size made them very vulnerable in the desert because they were so visible. Because of these limitations, the Bishop was found to be unsatisfactory and quickly replaced with things like the M7 Priest and the Sexton with the 25-pounder. And yeah, I think this will be a great addition to kind of lower tier Britain, as Britain doesn't really have many HE slingers, and I think it would help out their lower lineups a lot, give us a bit more interesting vehicles. And of course, if you guys have any more vehicles you'd like me to go over, just put them in the comments below, and I'll gladly go over them when I get a chance in maybe one of the next videos. Even if it's not the next video, it will eventually show up in a video if you guys give good suggestions. And with that, I would like to thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this video. And if you guys have any questions, comments on any of the vehicles I went over in this video, just let me know. I can answer them in the comments below as well. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.